This is the Miss Libertarian Podcast. I'm your host, Jess Gill, and today I'm honoured to be joined by Kerry McDonald, who is a podcast host of the podcast LiberatED, the author of the book Unschooled, and also a senior fellow at FEE. Kerry, would you be able to tell us a bit about yourself?
Sure. It's great to be with you, Jess. I really focus on educational freedom and expanding choice and opportunities for families and learners, trying to help create a decentralized marketplace of education that's very personalized, very focused on individual child's needs, and it's reflecting family values and preferences in much the same way that we have that choice, personalization, customization in all other areas of our lives, but somehow not so much in education. And I think that's largely because we have a government-run monopoly, essentially, on public schooling. You're compelled to attend school from typically ages 6 to up to 18 in certain states. And I think that can limit families' choices when they're assigned to a local district school and don't necessarily have the means to opt out of that. Of course, I think we'll talk a little bit about how school choice policies have been expanding, certainly over the last couple of years, to enable education funding to follow students instead of going to school systems. And that's really enabling that choice and personalization to skyrocket, enabling more families to have more options, and creating really this dynamic, vibrant marketplace of education possibilities for families.
Great. So could you tell us a bit about the American education system? Because my knowledge on it is very limited to the High School Musical series. So it'd be great to have your professional input.
Yeah, so I talk about the history of American education in my Unschooled book, really tracing the history of compulsion in education back to the 17th century and looking at kind of the difference between those early compulsory education laws that were first passed in the 1640s, not long after the Pilgrims arrived in what became Massachusetts Bay Colony. They passed the colony's first compulsory education laws, but then over the subsequent 2 centuries, those laws evolved, and in 1852, Massachusetts passed America's first compulsory attendance laws, compulsory schooling laws. And what happened at that point was education became narrowed into the 4 walls of a public school classroom. So what had previously been a broad definition of education, diversely offered, all kinds of different options for families. Of course, we certainly had cultural issues around women and minorities being excluded from education at the time. But in terms of what was offered and what was available to families, there were church schools, charity schools for the poor, homeschooling was the default. There was this expectation that adolescents would be participating in apprenticeship programs to learn their future vocations. There were dame schools in your neighbor's kitchen that acted like little nursery schools and kindergartens. And there were public schools that were required by municipalities to be offered. So that was where the compulsory education piece from the kind of earlier days in the 1600s, that compulsion required cities and towns to offer public schools for anyone who wanted them, but didn't require parents to only select public schools. And in fact, many didn't, as I've just described. And so then when compulsory schooling statutes were passed in 1852, that all changed. And now parents were required to send their children to a public school under a legal threat of force. And of course, many families rebelled. In fact, Horace Mann, who was the architect of that first compulsory schooling statute in Massachusetts, homeschooled his own 3 children without any intention of sending them to the common schools he mandated for others. You had many Irish Catholic families that had emigrated to Massachusetts and specifically to Boston over the previous decades leading up to that compulsory attendance law. And they certainly didn't want to send their children to these purportedly secular public schools, but that were, for all intents and purposes, Protestant schools, which was the dominant kind of Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture of the time. They had the King James Version of the Bible. They had Protestant teachers and texts. So there was definitely a sense that that was sort of the preferred worldview, and anyone who sort of strayed from that, especially immigrants, definitely felt excluded. And so in the case of Irish Catholics, they began creating their own parallel system of parochial schools and said, we're not going to send our children to these Protestant schools, we'll create our own. And that's really what happened. And of course, now you kind of fast forward more than a century later, and we do see now even more families and entrepreneurs and others sort of creating new education models outside of the conventional classroom. Again, some of that being accelerated by school choice policies, but all really focused on decentralization of education and moving away from this one-size-fits-all compulsory mass schooling model.
What do you think is the issue of standardized education? Because I assume it's a quite similar situation in the UK than the US, but with the UK, there's not really been that demand for school choice, funnily enough. But in the UK, it's like you're in a classroom and those who are academically better than others aren't really prioritized, they're not pushed. It's like, as long as you meet this requirement, you're not really discussed. Whereas if you're a student who's misbehaving, for example, the attention is on them. Like, I remember in maths class, for example, we would have to wait until the naughty kid behaved. Meanwhile, the well-behaved kids, they weren't really prioritized or paid attention to. So as long as you reach that standard, you weren't really considered. And there's also different types of learning abilities. Like, I'm sure there's people who learn best with like flashcards or verbal compared to the ones who, like myself, best left to their own. What do you think are the main issues with standardization?
Well, I love to give the example of the breakfast aisle of the local grocery store, right? So if you go into the breakfast aisle of any supermarket or grocery, you will find a wide variety of choices. So you will have pancake mix, and you'll have breakfast bars and granola bars and every imaginable selection of cereals. You'll have oatmeal, you'll have granola, you'll have organic and non-organic options, you'll have small batch local options and mass produced options. And there's a panoply of choices. And imagine if instead of that, you went into the breakfast aisle and you just had Lucky Charms, or you just had organic oats. And that was all you had. And that's not going to reflect the wide variety of preferences and individual needs and interests that each of us has. And that's what standardization does, right? It simply says this is the only choice for you, chosen on high by some elites or experts, so-called experts, who think they know what is best for you for your breakfast. And it really, I think, is counter to the values of a free society that's really focused around choice and abundance and free markets. And that simply is not reflected in education. But what we're seeing, and certainly what I'm most excited about occurring over the past several years, this has been really taking place throughout the past couple of decades, but it's accelerated since the education disruption caused by the COVID response, is a recognition that that one-size-fits-all standardized mass schooling model is not only ineffective and mismatched to sort of the needs of individuals and to the realities of the 21st century, but that it's also, not suiting children. It's not helping children prepare them for again, sort of the economic and social realities of the day. And so what we're seeing are these entrepreneurial parents and educators, everyday entrepreneurs, who are creating alternatives to that. They're creating low-cost private schools with a real individualized curriculum and approach. They're creating micro schools, which are really these intentionally small mixed stage models, similar to what we would think of as the one-room schoolhouse of yesteryear, again, often with a highly personalized curriculum. We see learning pods, which is similar to what we would think of as a homeschool co-op, but often has hired educators. We see, of course, the growth in high quality virtual learning platforms. So there's all kinds of possibilities. And of course, homeschooling has skyrocketed since 2020. It was already growing pre-pandemic and now remains well above pre-pandemic levels, even as schools have returned to normal, as families really value that freedom and flexibility of learning outside of a conventional classroom. And so I think that there is this recognition that we want more personalization and customization and individualization in education. We want to move away from that standardized model. And I should also say that in my travels, I've kind of crisscrossed the country visiting many of these entrepreneurs, these school founders and parents and educators building kind of the education ecosystem. I find tremendous diversity, not only in terms of the entrepreneurs who are building these programs, in the families that they're serving, but also in their educational philosophies and approaches. So we see all kinds of different models, from classical education models, faith-based models, secular models, child-centered models like Montessori or Waldorf, or unschooling and self-directed education models. There's really something for every family to choose from. And I think that, again, goes back to building the breakfast cereal aisle, or the breakfast aisle for education, that is complete with that abundance and that variety.
What do you think about the claim that if we just privatise, got the government out of education, then only the rich would be able to access education? That's the need for taxpayer money is argued. What do you make of that criticism?
Well, I think, again, if we go back to the way education was set up before compulsory schooling statutes, there was a wide assortment of education options available to families. There was an extremely high literacy rate. So education was being offered, it was being provided from a really decentralized platform, a decentralized way. And so I think that that same thing would be true if we had a vibrant free market in education. We would see abundance, we would see a whole assortment of options for families, and we would see costs come down, just as we see in any kind of robust free market of services. So there will be something for everyone. I think, certainly that is the libertarian ideal, is that we would have a fully decentralized free market in education with zero government involvement and zero government funding. But that's a long way off, and the kind of initial or incremental steps that would create a more vibrant marketplace of education with more options is not only to encourage education entrepreneurship and expand the supply of options, which of course will also help to make those programs more accessible to more families, the more competition and variety of programs exist, but also when we have school choice policies that enable education funding to follow students. And that is really what we're seeing already in 2023. We've seen 7 states introduce or expand their school choice policies to become universal, meaning all K-12 students in those states are eligible. And these funds sort of range in terms of what is provided or how you can use those funds, and in the range of kind of costs that are offered. But we'll say somewhere, between $6,000 and $8,000, which is really right in the range of what we see for some of these low-cost private schools and micro schools that are being created, what their price point is too. And so there's just so much more opportunity for families to find the right educational fit for them, and certainly to help learners make sure that they're learning in the best way possible.
It's really inspiring to see this growth in educational choice, because the government is expanding in so many areas. So I think this is the light in the whole darkness of statism. Thank you so much for joining me in this podcast. It's been a really useful conversation. Where can people find you if they want to find out more about your work?
Sure. Thanks, Jess. It's been great to be with you. You can find me at LiberatEdPodcast.com.